I'm going to sort of interact with you all today. We're going to have a conversation together for the time that we have. I've learned that over the years of giving speeches, at least publicly, that it's important for me to do a little bit of a disclaimer. I am from Boston, which means that there may be some words you may not understand because there's a particular letter that we just do not recognize in the alphabet. And so if I am saying something that maybe you can't fully understand what I'm saying, or it's just sort of one ear and out the other, please ask me to repeat. I try to switch out for words such as automobile instead of that other word. Or I'll say begin instead of that other word. And so we'll try to make this as interactive as possible, but feel free to chime in and ask me to repeat something if you need to. So on the PowerPoint here, I'm going to go through a few slides, so hopefully I don't keep everybody too bored, so we can be as interactive as possible. And there's a couple of numbers on here, right? So 12.7%, what is it? 12.7%? Okay, 12.7%? One more person. 12.7%, anything? 12.7% of Americans are in poverty today. 43.1 million. What do you think? 43.1 million? Oh, not so much. 43.1 million Americans in poverty today. Just a different look at the number. 33.3%. What do you think? 33.3%. Children? Anybody else? 33.3%? 33.3% of people in poverty are Black or African American. 31.8. What do you think?
People who told a lie today.
People who told a lie today. 31.8% Native American or Alaskan Native. 25.9%, let's hear it. Latino, exactly. Why am I telling you this? Okay, sure. I'm also going to tell you this not only because folks are minorities and marginalized identities, but also because this is what runs through the minds of the majority of us in the room when working with particular populations, whether we know it or not. And it's incumbent upon us to understand that before we even walk through the door and begin to do our work. Today, I'm not going to talk to you all as social workers, as United Way employees, as employees of other institutions, as parents, as children. Today, I'm hoping to talk to you all as intelligent human beings. I'm hoping to speak to everybody today and talk to the core of what I like to call your basic human decency, because my belief is that the only way this basic human decency can be achieved is with an understanding of what it means to be socially just. So we're going to take a walk through something that I created that I call the core 5 components to social justice. The idea is that through these 5 components, we all have at least a foundational understanding of what social justice is. As I said, my name is Sherard Robbins. Again, I serve as the Assistant Dean of Students at the University of Arizona. I'm a Chief Diversity Trainer for many of the students and staff. I do a lot of things in the name of bias and implicit bias, as well as other diversity topics. And so I want to give you all a small peek today of what the social justice components look like. We're not going to go through the training module per se, but we will explore some of the activities that we have. Okay? Sound good? All right. A couple more disclaimers. Although this isn't a training session, I think it's still important to note that when I sort of do my professional work, I don't operate in good or bad or right or wrong. It is not my job to necessarily espouse a belief upon you, but rather my job is to meet folks where they are so we can get to a place together. I don't intentionally seek to harm anybody. I don't intentionally seek to offend anybody. My job is to introduce an alternative perspective and allow you to create the cognitive dissonance within yourselves, okay? A diamond is a diamond. So, the core 5 components to social justice, they are as follows. Power and privilege, identity and intersectionality, systems of socialization, cultural competence, and allyship and advocacy. Again, my belief is that from these 5, you will understand the rest of what it means to be socially just and the rest of social justice. So let's walk through it. Privilege is, who wants it? What is privilege?
Getting everything handed to you because of your color.
Getting everything handed to you because of your color. My friend here, what is privilege? What do you think of?
Class.
Having doors open to you because of your class. So I've heard color and class specifically in the name of identities. Let's see. Privilege, according to the sociological definition, is a tiered system of benefits that lead to advantages for particular dominant groups based on their location within a social hierarchy. What this does is it takes privilege from something tangible and puts it into a system. That's important to note. Okay, so now we talk about social power. I know everybody has their eyes down because they know I'm coming around. Social power, what do you think it is? Having inherent privilege based on who you are. Fantastic. Social power? And it's okay to pass, folks. I know I'm pointing folks out. Feel free to be like, no, I'm not going. Feel free to exercise that option. Wonderful. Social power. Sorry. He looked at me like he wanted to chime in, so I figured. That's okay. No worries. Absolutely. I think that was a great definition we heard earlier, so let's go off of it. Social power is the ability of an actor or actors to achieve his or her will in a social action, even against the resistance of others. This is a Max Weber definition. Even against the resistance of others. What does that mean? That means that there are particular identities that are afforded certain level of privilege that regardless of the level of resistance, they are still able to enact their will. How many people here feel like they hold an identity racially that sort of molds to this? How about in the name of gender? Okay, let's keep talking. Here are the 5 concepts of privilege as said by McIntosh, okay? Privilege is a special advantage. It is neither common nor universal. Privilege is granted and bestowed, not innate or natural. Privilege is a right or entitlement that is related to a preferred status or rank. Privilege is exercised for the benefit of the recipient and to the exclusion or detriment of others. Privileged status is often outside of the awareness of the person possessing it. Okay? So here's what's unique about these 5 concepts of privilege. Privilege can either be earned or unearned, and here's what I mean by that. Some folks in this country will benefit from what's called white privilege. What that means is that there's a system in this country that's designed to place benefits and advantages to individuals who have white skin. There's a lot of research on this, and although this isn't the training session, so we won't go into it, I wanted to note that. There's also male privilege. We understand patriarchy, so there are benefits that are granted and advantages to individuals who identify as men or as males. But here's what's unique. I like to tell people all the time, we think of a diamond. A diamond is sort of the end-all, be-all when it comes to status. It's sort of that elite level that one can attain and one can reach. But a diamond is just a diamond until I put value on it. Aside from that, it's just a piece of the earth. Sediment. Privilege is no different. Privilege is absolutely no different. Being white just means you're a white American, unless I put value on it. Being a man is just being a man, unless I put value on it. And it's important to note that, because if we understand the systemic portion of this conversation, we are then able to begin addressing it in ways that are appropriate for all of us, and especially ways that are socially just. So here are some different types of identities that garner privilege. Race and ethnicity, we talked about white privilege. What's unique here, I mentioned ethnicity because although sort of this term white really refers to white Americans, white skin is what we're talking about when we address privilege. So you can be of European descent, you can come to the Americas, especially the United States, and still garner white privilege as a result of your skin. Gender is male privilege. Sexual orientation, heteronormativity, straight, heterosexual individuals. Socioeconomic status, upper class folks. Age, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. Differing degrees of ability, able-bodied. Religion and spirituality, Largely in this country, that's Christianity. Any others folks can think of? Height. Absolutely. If I miss you, just shout it out. It's a pretty big crowd. Education, absolutely. That's critical. So as we know, that privileges sort of range far and wide. So it's important to understand that they are concepts that are part of the larger system. So I want to take a second to have folks think about a couple of these questions, and we can share out for folks who feel comfortable doing so. It's always going to be challenged by choice, so don't feel like you are pressed, even though I'm coming around. So I do an activity called the privilege checklist. What I do is I paste a couple of statements on a chart, and I ask individuals to tally them up. So if the statement is true to you, you would write the number 1. If it sometimes occurs in your life, number 3. If it's false, you would write the number 5. Okay? So here's a statement. Generally, people of my race are not represented positively in the media. I have been homeless. Statement number 2. Number 3. I have skipped a meal to save money. Number 4, I often believe that I will be hassled in airport security lines. And number 5, I believe that the justice system works in the best interest of others except me. So we don't have to jot anything down or tally up. I'm going to read through them one more time, and I'm going to ask folks to volunteer to share out if you like. Generally, people of my race are not represented positively in the media. 2, I have been homeless. 3, I have skipped a meal to save money. 4, I often believe that I will be hassled in airport security lines. 5, I believe that the justice system works in the best interest of others except me. Feel free to show your hands. Feel free not to show your hands. Generally, people of my race are not represented positively in the media. Show of hands if this rings true for your identities. Feel free to take a look around the room, folks who are here. Okay? Number 2, I have been homeless. Feel free to show your hands. Okay? Number 3, I have skipped a meal to save money. Okay? Number 4, I often believe that I will be hassled in airport security lines. Okay? Number 5, I believe that the justice system works in the best interest of others except me. Okay. I want to hear some thoughts for folks that, if you wouldn't mind sharing out. What comes to mind from doing this activity? What are some realizations, if anything? Feel free to just shout it out. One more time. I am privileged. Who else? There's stigma. Okay. Anything else? Border security is totally unfair. Do you want to extend a little bit more on that?
I drive through every time, and I watch everybody else in the darkness get stopped with questions. People get driven, no reason at all. It's totally unfair.
Totally unfair. Interesting you bring that up. I drove to a conference last weekend in San Diego with my good friend, Dr. Jesus Trevino, who was in the audience. And when I showed up, I ran into him, and I told him I came through Border Patrol, and I actually got stopped. The people in front of me didn't get stopped. And after I got stopped, I waited, and the people in my rear view didn't get stopped either. There was one difference. What was it? Color of my skin. And we can articulate that, right? Oh, we're just doing random selections. You just happen to be the 10th person. I could say sure. Or I can look a little bit deeper and recognize how privilege works as a system. And that's something that we all need to do. It's incumbent upon us to be able to check our privileges, at the very least identify what they are, before moving on with the rest of our day to work with people who own other marginalized identities. It's important for us to know how our privilege shows up and the amount of space that it takes up. Okay? Component number 2, identity and intersectionality. Is anybody familiar with the term intersectionality? Show of hands. Okay. It is a term that's been around for a few decades now, but it hasn't really caught on outside of higher education, for example. So to give you a brief overview, and it's on the PowerPoint as well for those who are close enough to see it or for those who are able to read it. Kimberly Crenshaw was a law professor and coined this term in 1989. Essentially what happened was a couple of black women brought to her a few issues that they face in the workplace that was not necessarily isolated to race and also wasn't isolated to gender. They couldn't really grasp what it was, but they knew that it was impacting their identities. So essentially what Kimberly Crenshaw did was a court case was brought, she led the case, and she argued in front of the judge saying that these women are being harassed and hassled based on the identities that they hold. Long story short, what the judge ruled was that I recognize that there is some harassment going on here. I'll concede and give you that. However, you cannot make an argument on the grounds of race and gender. It's not a both and, it has to be either or. It's one or the other. From there, Kimberly Crenshaw began doing work on what she called intersectionality, the intersections of our identities, but rooted oftentimes in oppression. Okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about identity and intersectionality. So I'm going to read these off just because I have them on the screen. I think it's important. And it's kind of small, the font. Types of oppression. Individual oppression, the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate an ism. For example, racism, sexism. Individual expression can occur at both the unconscious and conscious level, and can both be active and passive. Cultural oppression, those aspects of society that overtly and covertly attribute value and normality to dominant identity groups, and devalue, stereotype, and label subordinated groups as other, different, less than, or render them invisible. Institutional oppression, the network of institutional structures, policies, and practices that create advantages and benefits for dominant groups, and discriminate, oppress, and disadvantage people from subordinate groups. The advantages created for dominant groups are often invisible to them, or are considered rights available to everyone as opposed to privileges awarded to only some individuals or groups. Very important desegregation. Dominant identity group, members of a specific identity group who have relatively more social power than subordinated identity groups. This subordination is supported by the actions of individuals, cultural norms and values, and the institutional structures and practices of society. Subordinate identity group, members of a specific identity group who have relatively less social power than a dominant identity group. We can have individual oppression. This could even look parent to child. This could be professor to student. This could be supervisor to boss. It could be friend to friend. Cultural oppression. How does your group, your identity group, show up? Let's say in the context of this country. Institutional oppression, we can talk about that systemically, or we can talk about that in the nature of a general institution. Dominant identity groups and subordinate identity groups. Let's talk about them a little bit. So this is a worksheet from the Social Justice Training Institute. It's a little bit dated. I've sort of revised a little bit. There's 20 of these, I only have 11 here. For folks who can see it, feel free to take a glance. For folks who can't see it, I'll try to read some of them, but I'm going to be brief. So this is the dominant subordinate worksheet. What I do with this activity generally is down the middle you see an identifier or a classification. Age, race, biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, etc. On the left you see dominant groups. On the right you see subordinate groups. What I ask individuals to do is based on your identities and based on where you fall in these particular categories, I ask you to either check, circle, draw a pair of glasses, what have you, in the group that corresponds with the classification with respect to your identities. So age, if you are younger or older than 30, if you're younger than 30 or older than 50, you would put yourself in the subordinate group. If you are 30 to 50, you would put yourself in the dominant group. For example, sexual orientation. If you identify as a member of the LGBTQIA+ community, you would put yourself in the subordinate group. If you identify as heterosexual, you would put yourself in the dominant group. So, age, younger than 30, older than 50. Race, these are your subordinate groups. Race, person of color, or people who identify as biracial or multiracial. Biological sex, female, intersex, anyone born biologically male. Gender, identity expression. Again, these are your subordinate groups. These are the ones that do not garner privilege in the context of this country. Gender identity and gender expression. Transgender, gender fluid, genderqueer, ambiguous, androgynous. Employment, part-time, student, unemployed. Hierarchical level, social service, food industry, K-12 teacher. This is really perception more than anything else. Sexual orientation, a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. Socioeconomic status or class, working class or living in poverty. Educational level, associate's degree, high school degree, GED. Religion or spirituality, anything that's not Christian. National origin status, born in a country other than the United States. Those are your subordinate groups. Of those 11 that I shouted out, how many folks will say that they have at least 5 of those? Of those 11 I shouted out, how many folks will say they have at least 7 of those? Of those groups I shouted out, how many would identify with at least 9 of these? Subordinate, yes, the subordinate, yes. How many people would argue that they identify with at least 5 of the dominant identities? So anything I did not say. How many people would say that they identify with at least 7 of the dominant identities? 9. All 11. What does this tell us? We're all in the same room. Yes, please. That the people in power are a smaller group.
But have proportionately more power than everybody else.
But have proportionately more power than everybody else. Yes. Yes.
And judging from the hands, I'm thinking that in our field, we are more multicultural than some fields.
And judging by the hands that came up, our field is more multicultural than some fields. Sure. Absolutely. What's also unique here is that this is easy to do when we relegate it to an identity. But once we begin to intersect some of these, it changes things. For example, I own arguably the most subjugated identity in the context of this country, which is to be black, period. I'm not going anywhere else but to be black. Now, the issue here as well is that there's another identity I own, which is male. So being black and being male changes the intersection a little bit, okay? That gives me certain advantages that other folks may not get. In my history, in my experience, I've been able to have conversations with a white woman next to me, with another man talking to us. Who do you think gets the attention in that conversation? I do. Even though I own black skin, the masculinity, the maleness that I'm presenting sort of supersedes that in the nature of that conversation, okay? So of the identities that we know, that we own, and that we hold, which identity do folks think about most? Which identity do folks think about least often? Which identity do you think people see first when they look at you? Which identity has brought the most hardship into your life? Which identity has granted the most privilege? We won't go through these out loud for time purposes, but I'm going to read them one more time, and I want you to think about this. Which identity do you think about most often? Which identity do you think about least often? Which identity do you think people see first when they look at you? Which identity has brought the most hardship into your life? And which identity has granted you the most privilege? We're going to talk about systems of socialization a little bit, okay? I want folks to do me a quick favor and sort of close their eyes or put yourself in a place where you can remove yourself from this room for a quick second, okay? What I want you to do now is I want you to picture an American, okay, who is a housekeeper. Okay, now picture an American who is in prison. Okay, we can open our eyes, we can come back together. What did your American look like? See? Multicultural, okay? Anybody else? People of color, okay? You get a flood of different images of different people for your American. Very good. What did your housekeeper look like? You can just shout it out. A woman? Latina? Okay. And what did your prisoner look like, the person in prison? Black man? Latino male? What happened? Stereotypes? The instructions were simple. You all did the rest of the work. What occurred there is your implicit bias woke up, because we all have it. I know you probably want me to say we don't, but we all have it, myself included. Your implicit bias woke up. All I had to do was paint a small picture, just give a scenario. You did the rest of the work. Implicit bias is something we need to check, because the systems of socialization, and by that I mean conditioning, have been training us since birth to read individuals and groups in a particular way. For sake of time, I'm going to just pop these up here. Socialization is the process of inheriting norms, customs, and ideologies. Social conditioning is the process of training individuals in a society to respond in a manner generally approved by the society in general and peer groups within the society. Some types of socialization are primary socialization, essentially where a child would learn values and norms. Secondary socialization is where you would learn the values and norms at a secondary institution, for example, what you may learn on your basketball team or in high school or at church. Developmental socialization, this involves a learning process wherein the focus is on developing skills. Anticipatory socialization, the process where a person practices or rehearses for future relationships. And re-socialization is when it involves rejecting previous behavior in order to adopt something new. Okay? Number 4 is focused on cultural competency. Cultural competency is where I would explore stereotypes, I would explore triggers, and I would explore the way we are conditioned to perceive different groups and different individuals. For example, I tell folks all the time that if I'm going to war, with this country, for example, or anywhere, don't give me a gun, don't give me a knife, give me the system. Because the system is the most powerful tool you have. It can either paint me this way, or it can paint me this way. But it's really up to the system. For example, if a great white shark were to wash up on the shores with a harpoon through it, for example, I don't mean to be callous, but it works for the example. The first reaction people do is, whew, I'm glad somebody took care of that because it was dangerous. I feared for my life. Now my children are safe. Now my family is safe. Well, in my experience, it hasn't been much different for at least black men, and I'm going to stay with the black-white binary because I'm comfortable talking about blackness because I identify as such. And the last thing I would ever do is appropriate. And so similarly to black men, which is why we see a lot of sort of black bodies being murdered or killed in the streets without necessarily just justification or due process as a result at the end of it. Because the image of the black man is one that is volatile, is hostile, and has been deemed dangerous for years and years and years. Because the system has tainted the image. It's up to you all, it's up to all of us to challenge that at every chance we have. Okay, and so wrapping up right here as the last component is allyship and advocacy. It's important to make this distinction that allyship is to the individual and advocacy is to the cause. Okay, we all want to be allies. We all want to assume, I'd gather, that we're decent human beings. We all want to be like this guy, right? An ally to other individuals, to other groups that are oppressed, to be progressive, to assist in the work. Allyship gets you this. You know what advocacy gets you? It usually gets you this. which is why a lot of people do not advocate. They'll work towards allyship, they'll be inclusive, they'll hire folks, we'll do what we need to do, but the next step of retention, of support, of however it shows up in your fields, is challenging the existing social structures, the power systems, and that's a problem. You don't need me to tell you this. It doesn't even have to be a black individual. Think back in history about somebody who took a significant stance against a social structure, against some sort of oppression. Then go look them up right now and see where they are. See what site you can visit them at, oftentimes. But we don't have to end up here. There are different niches for all of us. There's another presentation I have called Effective Radicals, Challenging Social Systems from Baldwin to Davis. It looks at different levels of being radical. We look at Angela Davis or Malcolm X when we hear radical, and we think about people who are showing up with their hair out, t-shirt on in court, fist in the air. We don't think about James Baldwin, who had the suit on and was in front of white legislatures or sort of folks in the middle of the country. We don't think about Dolores, who was with the farmers and making things happen. This may not be your niche, and that's okay. That's totally fine. Find where you are strongest and make it happen from there. I'm going to stop here for time purposes. I don't want to go over. I'm happy to send these slides out, but these are just really questions. If folks have any that sort of look at, does unconscious bias influence behavior? Happy to present that. And I thank you all for giving me the opportunity this morning. Thank you.